Welcome to day 4 at the World Economic Forum 2022. You are at the Woodhouse at Davos, and I'm super excited to bring the Woodhouse community that we started at COP26. This here is a virtual platform, but what you see behind you is actually a real house that we had in Glasgow. Wood as a company are supporting the 17 global goals, and we are dedicated to clean energy. Yesterday was a huge energy day, and if you missed the opportunity, you should go back to the World Economic Forum platform. It was all about navigating the energy transition, and it was all around accelerating, scaling up climate innovation. Some of the key speakers yesterday was the Minister of Energy at Saudi Arabia, and it was also Bill Gates and John Kerry and many, many more who spoke yesterday. There's no doubt about it that hydrogen was the big topic of the day yesterday, and that's why I'm super excited that how we kick off today here in the virtual Woodhouse at Davos. We are really starting the day with a hydrogen session. So the session today is the role of hydrogen to support a net zero world. How has COP26 changed the outlook for clean hydrogen? And listen here, it's not just a conversation. We have actually launched a white paper together with Reuters and together with many other great companies. And that is what the conversation is going to be about today. You can download the white paper. It's called How Has COP26 Changed the Outlook for Clean Hydrogen? With me, I have some amazing people that I had the pleasure actually to meet in person at COP in November. So I have Luca Bretz, who is the product director from Reuters. I have Josh, Vice President Hydrogen from Woods. I have Daryl Wilson, Executive Director for Hydrogen Council, and Paul Bogger, VP for Hydrogen Shell. And then, of course, Asad, who is going to drive the moderation, and he's the President Strategy for Development at Woods. So over to you, Asad, and I'll be stopped sharing.
Great, thank you, and it's my pleasure to be attending this event. Fortunately, I've missed out on going to Woodhouse in Glasgow due to travel restrictions, but super delighted to be attending this session, albeit virtually. So today, as Anne mentioned, we're going to talk about the role of hydrogen in supporting net zero, and specifically we want to reflect back on COP26 and what was achieved, and also more importantly, look forward to what that means for the next year and also beyond. And as we all know, achieving net zero is going to impact how we live. And an important part of that is going to be how we change our energy mix, and within it specifically is the future fuels that we will use. Clearly, hydrogen is emerging as a key player in the future energy mix and the future fuels mix. And specifically also where industries that are not able to pivot to electrification. There are certain heavy industries that simply don't have the option to electrify. And some of those are well known: aviation, heavy industries such as chemicals, and then steel making, cement, and so on. So what's emerging as a contender and an enabler is actually hydrogen. So today we want to talk about that and see how the conversation progresses from COP26 forward. And if I were to quickly summarize, we saw the beginning of the end for coal investments. We arrived at large agreement globally to limit investments in coal, and that's a great thing. And focus more on emissions, such as emissions from methane, and replacing them with cleaner fuels such as hydrogen. What we'll talk about today with the panel members is how capital is actually ready to be deployed for hydrogen generation across the full value chain of hydrogen economy, and how technology is evolving to reduce costs and scale up the production so that we could accelerate the transition to a hydrogen economy, especially for those hard to decarbonize industries that contribute significantly to the emissions and global warming. So with that quick overview, I'm just going to spend a few minutes introducing our panel members. Luke, may I ask you to quickly give a quick introduction to yourself, please?
Thank you, and pleasure to be here. So I head up the hydrogen unit at Reuters Professional. So what we're doing is working to support our subscribers with content. And so that means we're producing white papers like this one with Wood, producing events, and really propelling the hydrogen industry and connecting them with the critical information they need for expansion.
Great, thank you. We'll move clockwise. I'll go with Paul, please.
Yes, thanks, Zad, and thanks so much for having me on this on this panel. I see this really comfortable leather chair behind Josh, and I was wondering, you know, kind of this would be so much more fun if it was indeed on the stage in Davos. So, you know, my role in Shell is to look after all aspects of hydrogen development, regardless of which color. Except for gray hydrogen, which we believe is not a particularly attractive color, because that's what we use today. But all aspects, whether that is, you know, these hard to electrify, you know, industry sectors, as well as mobility and especially kind of heavy goods transport. So across all of those, we see both fantastic opportunities, but also, you know, are really in the weeds with the challenges of how we kind of build the first of a kind, you know, kind of assets in that space.
Yeah, great, thank you, Paul. Daryl, would you please take a minute to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you. The Hydrogen Council for the last 5 years has worked very hard to identify the opportunity and promise of hydrogen and decarbonization. And I think we've seen a great success story at COP. There was lots of hydrogen discussion. And we've been working also to identify the neck points and blocker points where there's difficulty for hydrogen to deliver on that promise. Cost, of course, is one of those major perceived areas. And so we've been charting the cost reduction journey of the industry so that it can deliver on the promise and do so in a cost-effective manner. So it's been a wonderful journey of the last 5 years, lots of progress, but there's lots still to do.
Well said, thank you. And then my good colleague, Josh, please go ahead.
Thanks, Josh Carmichael, the Vice President of Hydrogen for Wood. What does that mean? What does my job look like? Quite interesting. So almost actually all of the panelists I work with and for. So with Luke and Reuters, panels, thought leadership, white papers, Hydrogen Council, so that's policies, looking at a number of things, of which Wood is, of course, a steering member and a proud member of the Hydrogen Council, looking at some of the programs we can lead, and then, of course, working with clients globally, such as Shell and others, to help accelerate these projects to get them to a point where we're shovel ready and making those investments, because that's what we all need. So very much look forward to the discussion, and it's nice to see some familiar faces again.
Definitely, thank you, Josh. So why don't we just get started with some discussion now? And I'll probably start with the reflection on COP26. And it's quite fortuitous that we just launched this paper today that with our colleagues at Reuter Professionals and Wood. So with that, Luke, would you please give us your view, and maybe Josh, you can chime in from what the main takeaways were from COP26 and their impact on hydrogen.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of talk from COP26 on hydrogen. It really is going way up the agenda. I think what was interesting and what's come out from this white paper is really addressing that chicken and egg dilemma on how everything can scale up, and really just driving that demand, particularly for hydrogen, is how that market's going to form. And so soon as that business case is clear and more defined, you know, we see a lot of ESG capital ready and available. They want to see that business case defined. So I think post COP26 and the findings that we have from this report is really on getting the private sector to mobilize. There was a lot of foundational conversation, but I think, you know, it's really time to get moving. And I know Josh is a big advocate for that.
Definitely. So good leading and good segue. So I think for me, the main key takeaways, and Daryl, give you the floor as well. You were on our panel where we had a discussion around hydrogen and the uptake and what's required. The key themes that came out were technology's ready, there's capital ready to deploy, there's projects enough in the pipeline that are ready to be financed and shovel ready. So first, let's get on with it. And I think second of all, governments have been toing and froing around policy and grant funding. What we see also is private sector breakthrough energies from different investors. You've got other billionaires doing deals with each other, and that's what we saw at COP as well. You saw Andrew Forrest doing a deal for ammonia with Rise, JCB, for example, Joe Bamford. So, you know, that's going to happen and it will continue to happen. So we need the projects now to get going to feed those deals that are now going to be done, and the time for waiting is over. So those were the key themes that came out from our discussions at COP, and I certainly look forward to having those discussions with a number of our clients and stakeholders going forward. Daryl, maybe you want to add something on your experiences from our discussions?
It's a whole torrent of conversations, isn't it? It's not just about what's happening at the main table, but all of the conversations, literally hundreds of thousands of conversations among so many people. And this is critical to sustain a sense of urgency, to bring focus to issues that are open and need clarification. We had an extensive discussion with our members yesterday around Article 6, which is around the definitions and approaches to carbon measures. And progress was made there. So a big contribution, and in some ways it's hard to measure and see because there's just so many conversations. But I think the sense that hydrogen has a critical role to play and that we need to work hard to bring all of this, we sort of have everything on deck. We've got governments committing with policy and funding and a 560 project portfolio that we're tracking as the Hydrogen Council from the industrial side. But as Josh just said, we need to crack on with it. And the last stages of implementation to actually start to have the policy programs and funding moving into projects and the financing and mobilization of those projects post-investment decision, that's the hard part. And I think COP made a good contribution, as Josh just said, we need to crack on with this and move through that hard part apace, because the climate doesn't know anything is happening until those projects are running.
Yeah, thank you, Daryl. And Paul, I mean, you probably are the closest to the end market of this panel. So how do you see that? Do you see that actually panning out at the, you know, to link back to the chicken and egg and to what Daryl just said? How do you see it with the client and the end markets?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to say, as what Daryl called this torrent of conversations. How do you turn all of that entropy of the conversations into actual action, right, and projects? And I think you need to believe two things. One is that the demand is there, but you know, you need to orchestrate and synchronize the supply demand kind of balance, which means you can't just build projects in isolation and hope that demand will materialize, or vice versa. There's no point in developing a whole lot of use cases for hydrogen, whereas in the end, you know, you don't have the size and scale of the projects available for it. And policy can help bridge that gap, but also infrastructure is required to kind of help all of that. So it is one of those things where you really have to kind of go in lockstep between demand, supply, infrastructure, and policy. And that's hard to do. So we find that every project you have to originate, you need to bring these things together. That means, you know, you need to have not just a conversation with a customer that's excited about using hydrogen and doing a deal. You need to bring the OEMs along because you need the vehicles. You need to find the locations where you're going to build the hydrogen sites, and you need to get the hydrogen supply in at a scale that actually is affordable. So that market orchestration, and then sometimes what we find is some of these steps, you know, we talk about business cases, we talk about making it investable. They are belief-based decisions. So there has to be a belief that all the important work around the classification of hydrogen, all of the hard work around contracts for difference and other policy measures will fall in place because, you know, there are a lot of open switches.
Yeah, really good. I was just thinking about that. It's if you look at the current fuel value chain, it's taken what, 100 years that it's matured and it's in place. So we've got a blueprint, 100-year-old blueprint that's taken that long to mature and work like clockwork. And now we're trying to transform it to a new place. It won't happen overnight. That's why we generally call it energy transition. It's not an energy step change. So it's really interesting to see how that the way you framed it there. So maybe if that's a good segue to, do you think a lot has changed to facilitate that since COP? I know it was only literally a few weeks ago, but the torrent of the discussions that has happened, do you think that's actually making it more real and helping with the acceleration of the change?
I think it has, and it'd be interesting to hear other perspectives, right? So if you measure the success of the hydrogen economy by how many conferences there are around hydrogen, then I think we have hit peak conference, if you like, right? On the other hand, it's great to have a much more broad-based support, right? So I think when the Hydrogen Council was set up, I think there were maybe only 1 or 2 countries in the world that had an idea they wanted to create a hydrogen economy. The likes of Japan and maybe Korea had vocalized that. Now, having that broad-based support means that policymakers, they don't have a blank face when you talk to them about hydrogen. What a lot of hard work is still to be done is then translating that into, well, what are the relevant policies and coherent policies, and for how long do they have to be in place to really kickstart this? But I think Josh mentioned an interesting dynamic as well, in that it's not just government money. It's not just it's a handout for, kind of, we need this level of support to bridge that green premium. I think you've seen a lot more entrepreneurial parties and maybe even these charismatic billionaires saying, we will help, bridge that gap. And I think that's a new dynamic, and I think that is kind of accelerated since COP.
Yeah, Daryl, how do you see those priorities panning out in 22?
Safety's always been a very big priority for the council. We're going to continue to focus on that. Anytime we concentrate energy and use it, there's a hazard. And so hydrogen is not unique in this sense. There's a vast network of standards already in our history from industrial practice, but those standards and practices need to grow up as hydrogen takes its place more in our energy system. So safety continues to be a priority. And then on the whole area of sustainability, more and more focus on how we measure the environmental attributes of hydrogen, and if those attributes end up being traded and indeed part of the economics. And there is not enough consensus and clarity and definition around some of these things. So we have work to do in tracking and reporting and understanding how we manage the sustainability attributes of hydrogen. And then a topic close to my heart, I've been working in the sector for 15 years. And of course, in the early stages, when there's lots of small demonstration projects, the system view seems to be a very long way away. But now with the vision that hydrogen will take upwards of 22% of final energy use by 2050, we need to understand how hydrogen works in a systemic way, integrated with the whole energy economy. Not something off in the corner doing a specific job that is being told to do, but actually is an integral part of the energy system. Our energy system has been 3 silos for a long time: liquid fuels to get around, electricity to keep the lights on, and gas to keep us warm. And in some ways, hydrogen has a wonderful trade as an energy carrier to start bridging the divide between those 3 silos and make a systemic impact in our energy system. It's on us to tell that complex story, and it's not easy to do, but one of our priorities this year with the Hydrogen Council is to do some serious work in looking at how hydrogen becomes an integral part of the entire energy system and allows us to optimize and bring greater efficiency and, of course, decarbonization to the whole system in this protracted change that we've been talking about.
Great, thanks, Daryl. So maybe Luke can comment a little bit from the market in where do you see demand changing in a way that will help the chicken and egg, as you talked about and Paul touched on. How do you see that working?
Well, I think one interesting application that I'd be interested to hear from the rest of the panelists, whether this has perhaps surprised them, is the aviation sector. I think that there's a lot of activity there that I think perhaps a couple of years ago would have been maybe a bit of a pipe dream. And we spotlight that in this report, particularly comparing to sustainable aviation fuels. So I think, 2 companies to really look out for: Universal Hydrogen, Zero Via. They're doing some really interesting stuff in propelling this. And also, you know, if you look at a lot of countries as well, Denmark recently, by 2030, they don't want to have any carbon emitting flights domestically. So is that also, these incentives too are propelling and starting a market also to really drive forward. In terms of other applications, I think steel, you know, there's also a lot of interesting things going on in steel. And another case to kind of move back is looking at those hubs that are emerging. You know, I deviate too much from the topic, but you know, those hydrogen is best consumed often where it's produced, right? So these hubs that are emerging, they're really interesting. Obviously, Rotterdam is doing an awful lot. I was talking to the European Commission recently. They say they're seeing like hundreds of these emerging or proposals. So what's going to pull through is going to be very interesting in 2022, and you know, how these hubs and clusters, demand centers, however you want to term it, how they evolve and how that can actually be a driving force for decarbonization and really proving just the merit of hydrogen in decarbonizing the industries like steel, for example.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, the point that you touched on with the clusters and the consumption near production. I mean, Josh, maybe you can comment on this. It actually is highly regional. So you look at the Far East where they don't have the privilege to actually produce it. So they're going to have to rely on long distance transport and of the product. And in the US will be different and Europe will be different. So Josh, do you want to talk maybe around that frame we created around Make It Move It and how that will pan out?
Definitely. So what Azad's referring to there is we've tried to break it down simply to Daryl's point. We need to communicate this. We need to get the social license of hydrogen, and that means also speaking in a common language. What I was happy to see at COP26 was this moving away from the, let's call it the fight between green and blue, because the realization is that, you know, I mentioned at the COP as well, being colorblind to this is the key going forward, in that it all needs to be done at low carbon. If we're going to replace what is already in place, which is the grey, that's the enemy here. So I think that, you know, with that in mind, it's really interesting to see this make it, move it, use it simplicity, which is, you know, someone makes it, someone then moves it, and someone uses it, and sometimes it's all and different places. And rather than look at it as an individual, I make it and you use it, I think to Paul's points, the systematic approach, the need to bring this in together, and what was mentioned by Luke as well around clusters. I love Rotterdam. If I look at it as an example, I love what, you know, Shell are doing in their chemical plants. Look at Novion, for example, which is a spin-off from Nuvion. They've now invested, and you talk about private capital, Macquarie Green doing a $400 million euro deal, and it's, you know, using someone's waste to treasure. So this is an old, you know, chemical plant that uses hydrogen anyway. Let's make green, and I need to do it anyway on my own production facilities. And maybe the offtake is a long distance away, but it might also be a short distance. There's a gas network that can be used. There's a mobility. It might even well feed into Shell mobility ahead of Shell's own production. So Shell has a chemical plant, but it's being fed by, for example, Novion's offtake as part of their Shell mobility. And I think that's really the direction we need to head as a systematic approach. And, you know, I mentioned before, getting on with these projects, there will be demand and there will be supply, but coming together in these areas of cluster is really important. And highlighting to people that, yes, it's simple, making it, moving it, using it, but the application of it will be complex going forward. And, you know, we need to start figuring out what that complexity looks like and overcoming it. Having a number of clients on the same gas network, what happens when one jumps off, for example? These are the issues we need to get onto now before we get too caught up in a discussion on whether or not a gas network can handle the pressure. Let's start getting these projects working together and matching them together, because that's how we're going to show the market, you know, that it can be a viable option, because they need to be convinced. So that's, I think, the priority and the simplicity that needs to come with it. And just on that one last comment, there will be missteps. So, you know, I've learned also working in government for 3 years, in your best efforts to come up with policy, it's not always going to please all. And you see, for example, as part of the Fit for 55 package, they started to look at requiring all new green energy projects to be produced from new wind and solar parks. So your production needed to be also from new sources. That's the reality we need to face. We need to face that these new plants will require new forms of energy. Existing against existing infrastructure. Let's have that discussion, put it on the table, and see how we can all come together to electrify and also decarbonize at the same time. And they're not often the same thing.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you, Josh. Paul, do you see it, or within your within Shell, is that your view as well? How you go about? We're aware that you're very active in developing or looking at new hydrogen projects. Is that how you're looking at them in terms of pushing them forward in 22 and 23?
Yeah, no, I think we'd agree with a lot of what has been said, both at the systems level. I like the analogy of you know, make, move, use, if you like, and then you can do that at different you know, different length scales, if you like. So if you have a, you know, a large production facility in a cluster like Rotterdam, there's plenty of ways in which you can kind of feed it into an existing hydrogen network, and that's always going to be the most competitive way of getting it to the user. Moving it on a smaller scale to, you know, kind of hydrogen refueling sites, or maybe in the future to airports, is a completely different kind of challenge. Moving at a kind of transcontinental level is yet another challenge that we are trying to kind of solve and understand how to technically de-risk it. Just before I came on the call, I got the WhatsApp that the Hystra kind of vessel has actually safely arrived in Hastings in Australia to take the first load of liquid hydrogen. And you say, well, what's the big deal? Well, you know, up until over the weekend, I got messages saying this tsunami in Tonga, are we guys in deep enough water? So these are really big kind of projects that are first of its kind and carry a lot of kind of challenges and risks. And we're going to learn a lot from that in moving forward. So, but that idea around starting around clusters, to Luke's point, I think we see steel moving at a far more rapid pace than we would expect that sector to kind of embrace, you know, a completely different way of making steel. I think 4 or 5 years ago, we would have said these are unavoidable emissions because coal is part of the way you make steel. Therefore, you need a different solution, maybe CCS or something else. So you see these use cases kind of popping up left, right, and center. The aviation one, I always like to tell this story, but 1996, I graduated as an aerospace engineer. My thesis was on flying on hydrogen, working with Airbus. And the references I used were from 1979, or from NASA, that after the second oil crisis was looking seriously at flying in hydrogen. So maybe it's third time lucky that these ideas never quite die in the background.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, it comes back. It's all about timing. It's a bit like comedy. It's all about timing. You got to get the timing right. Investment is very much the same. Daryl, just maybe wanted to talk a little bit about, I mean, just like Josh, I'm color agnostic. And Anne and I were just talking about yellow and pink that are the emerging colors now. I think we have a teal color hydrogen as well. So there's a lot of colors. But at the end of the day, right now, there a lot of focus is on blue and green, and that's largely because the economics and unit pricing. So you at the center of it with all your members, how do you see the council council members rallying behind one or the other? Are they taking bets on one, or are they backing both? And where do you think the economics and the catalyst for economics of both green and blue coming down? Some of the elements. Let's just discuss that with the panel. So yeah, if you don't mind kicking that off for us, Daryl.
Sure, give me the easy one. So, you know, this whole scheme of colors was a communication device to help to simplify and clarify something. But in fact, it hasn't done that. And I can show you so-called blue hydrogen projects, which are a lot greener than the green hydrogen projects. It's very confusing. So what was meant to clarify has actually not helped. The key point here is we need to be talking about the specific CO2 intensity of any process. And I can assure you that large industrial firms who have committed to blue hydrogen projects, so-called, or clean hydrogen projects, or low carbon hydrogen projects, whatever you want to call them, they're well aware that they're making investments into a policy environment and into expectations around decarbonization. And if they cannot be assured that these projects will deliver on the specific CO2 intensity of that process, they're not going to spend the money. Now, the reality is today, out of 560 projects that we're tracking around the world, and these have been generated in multiple policy environments from multiple countries on multiple applications, it's running about 50-50. It's a bit of a surprise, frankly, because on the lower clean hydrogen side or blue hydrogen side, the cost of those projects from a production cost per kilogram is going to come in the $152 range. Meanwhile, the renewable hydrogen projects are going to come in the $4.50 to $5 range. So you can see that the economic difference between these two pathways is very dramatic. And the renewable hydrogen story is not going to just come down all by itself by the passage of time. We talk about, when is green hydrogen going to be at parity? It's not about when, it's about the contingent scale up actions need to happen to buy down that cost by scale up and by policy supplement and government support. So that's a difficult journey that's going to involve a lot of projects and a lot of investment. The good news is we're seeing the commitment to those investments, notwithstanding their early economics. So we have the policy right to get this process started, notwithstanding the disparity between the two pathways. So we're starting out about 50-50. Frankly, that's good news for the climate, because the scale and speed and amount of decarbonization that's being delivered by some of these blue hydrogen projects cannot be matched by green hydrogen today. And so if you go back to the home objective, we want to decarbonize as quickly as we possibly can and as large steps as we possibly can. The blue hydrogen story is giving us that today. And so those who want to demonize that story are in a way frustrating their own objectives. Meanwhile, there is policy commitment and funding and support from project proponents to build the early green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen projects so that indeed the cost curve will come down and we will reach that parity that we're aiming for. So this is, we love in the media, unfortunately, the either or battles. Luke, I'm not blaming you, but it's kind of the favorite path to go. And if you can get a demon to appear and an evil plot, it just feeds the frenzy. But I'm sorry, at 62, I've learned most of life is about both and. And this is a story that if we're going to realize our objectives, it's a both and story. And that's what's in fact happening in the portfolio projects. Forgive my passion. I'm a little tired about talking about blue versus green.
No, and I think you put that really well, Daryl. And I think if I see yet another kind of analysis of two very simplistic lines crossing over, right, to say, well, here it is. Just look at what's happening to energy prices, right, around the world at the moment. And so how could you even kind of contemplate that it's a simplistic equation that is just governed by a single number, right, or where you were break even? I think you will get to a point, as you say, around how you want to drive decarbonization as fast as you can and get to scale very quickly. Also getting to as many use cases as you can, because once those use cases for hydrogen are kind of multiplying and are in the right cost bracket, it will drive a lot of the innovation to get the cost of green hydrogen down over time. But it's got to go hand in hand and move away from this polarization.
Yeah, I fully agree. In a way, actually, I was reflecting on it over the break. It's not too dissimilar from the COVID crisis. It's a bit like saying, okay, well, let's pick Pfizer over Moderna and let's debate it for the next 5 years. No, we need in fact, I remember the authorities saying the best vaccine is the one that's offered to you, whether it's Moderna, whether it's AstraZeneca, whatever it is. And it's the same story here. The best solution is the one that helps reduce the emissions and get us to net zero as quickly as possible. So really good framing and overview there. I really appreciate that, Daryl and Paul. Luke, from your perspective, what are you seeing?
Or I suppose you have to go on LinkedIn to not go near the blue and green hydrogen debate. I think for me, what would be interesting to look at, particularly going into next year, is that the euro being used as a reference point, perhaps for hydrogen trading. So, and being color agnostic there. I know the EEX are launching an index to price hydrogen the next year. So I think that's going to be very interesting to see how that develops. And I think that will facilitate moving on from the color debate, certainly. But I'm not going to add too much on that one, because I think it's better to be on the fence to throw yourself into that debate.
Right, Luke, you can sit on the fence. Josh, go for it.
Okay, so I mean, what to say, the good comments that have already been made. I look at it in a number of ways. So my background for a long time was automotive, and I look at, so I did my master's, like I pulled from aviation, I did automotive, and exactly, you know, you mentioned 100 years to build the system. We had electric cars in the 1920s and 30s, as we did in the 90s, and my master's looked at how over the generations actually it came and went, and how the vertical and horizontal strategies looked at bringing that to life or not. And it was really interesting because I did it in 2007 and 8. And, you know, if we think about that time, we already had the Yaris, the Prius was coming online from Toyota. We had plug-in, and it wasn't until Dieselgate 2015-16 that all of a sudden, all those years of being told that it wasn't possible to do electric, became electric. So, you know, we were, you know, 2014, it wasn't possible, 2017, it was. But think about from 2017-16, Dieselgate until now, we didn't just stop driving internal combustion engines. We didn't just switch to electric. Plug-in hybrids came, which meant that the infrastructure for plug-ins were becoming more and more available, which meant that by the time that we got to electric in 2025, let's say 10 years, the infrastructure was ready for us, and then we could make the switch. I see the same in the discussion around hydrogen. If the infrastructure is going to be built out for the next 5 to 10 year applications uses like transport, fuel stations, these type of things, for example, the chemical plants, the steel that was mentioned, if the infrastructure is going to be built out because of blue projects that will help green by the time that it's affordable, I see that as only a positive. And so we should work together to build what we both need to achieve the longer term goal by 2030, which is the goal, and eventually 2050. And in the meantime, the economics will take care of itself. If we have a price hike, again, blue will go through the roof and it's not economical, green then becomes more economical, but we still need both to, as part of that transition, as we needed internal combustion with plug-in to get to electric, to get to fuel cell in the transport industry. Now that's the way I look at it, also for the energy transition as well, to be realistic about things.
Good, that's a really passionate contribution there, Josh. Thank you for that. I think as we're talking about costs, whether it's for blue or green, it'd be good to hear from the panel members here. Where do you see the biggest contribution towards cost reduction? I mean, for green, we heard there's an element of the scaling and learning that's important, but where do you see the supply chain needs to invest and get ready for? Where are the technologies? And, you know, let's also touch on human capital. That's something at Wood that we're actually facing. There is a ton of demand, and we're fortunate to have a rich pool of really smart problem-solving engineers in our business. But the torrent of interest, it's difficult to find the right folks to get in and deliver this. Let's not forget, this is a nascent industry, nascent business. It's not like you've got hydrogen engineers and experts growing on trees. So that's an area that certainly we're investing to find and train good engineers and consultants. But I wanted to hear from the panel members, where do you see the bottlenecks and how the supply chain and industry needs to tackle them? Daryl, I might start with you, please.
Well, I'm a manufacturing guy. I used to run manufacturing for Toyota in Canada. So this subject is near and dear to my heart. In my last 15 years in hydrogen, I saw costs on fuel cells and electrolyzers drop by almost half, 2 times. So we need to credit that already this journey has started and some very good progress has been made. but scale is the critical driver here. A typical electrolysis project over the last 50 years for industry has been somewhere between 100 kilowatts and 300 kilowatts, not even a megawatt. I was involved with building the largest new operating PEM electrolysis plant in Bécancour, Quebec with Air Liquide, and that's a 20 megawatt plant. So there you're going from, you know, the old project's 200 megawatts to the most recently built and operating plant, 20 megawatts. Shell, of course, has made an announcement at 200 megawatts, and at NEOM in Saudi Arabia, we have a 2 gigawatt project. So there you can see we're moving by orders of magnitude and scale. Now, what this does to manufacturers is it enables them to mature the supply chain and convert a lot of process capability and interest in innovation to drive the cost down. So typical electrolysis plants have never been operating at 100%. Now we're starting to build gigafactories and actually have the demand to run them flat out. That's a new thing. That scale will drive costs down. It's not just about the labor side of things, it's also about the supply chain. A lot of the critical materials to go into electrolysis or fuel cells, the demand is not significant to run a continuous process reel to reel at high speed. But in these new market conditions, that will be the case. So the yield and productivity and automation in the supply chain is going to drive the cost down. And then innovation is also very critical, and it will continue to happen. And as you see Breakthrough Energy now making investments in the space, we're going to see some good big step innovations. From a science point of view, the possibility is there. It's not a Moore's Law story, it's a different kind of chemistry, but there is absolutely big steps that can be made in catalyst loadings and innovations in those areas where we can see the cost come down. So I'm very excited about the demand stepping up to create the scale to actually drive the cost down. We forecasted this would happen as the Hydrogen Council over the last 5 years with regular reports, and it looks like things are more or less on the curve and on schedule. But as I said before, it doesn't happen by magic or by somebody saying so. We have to build the projects at scale to earn the right to enjoy the next level of cost down.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm glad you touched on Moore's Law, because some folks certainly have oversized expectations. This isn't Moore's Law, unfortunately. I wish it were, but nevertheless, the progress that's been made, it's been significant. And as you just said, with projects such as NEOM and the like, we expect more of that to come. Josh, what's your view on?
Yeah, so I won't get too caught on the cost side of things. I think there's a lot of conferences and panel discussions around how to reduce the cost of green, for example. Obvious ones are the cost of electrolyzer, you get through scale, you get through production, maybe some step change in design, for example. Then there's let's call it the project cost. So project financing with uncertainty increases costs. EPCs, the ability to find delivering partners, adds cost. There's a whole range of costs. What I find more interesting, though, is the discussion around value. And and we had a discussion yesterday on carbon. So traditionally, carbon focus on carbon accounting and the cost of carbon. But can you value carbon? Is it valuable to someone? And I say this because I look at the battery industry. So when we did the big battery project in South Australia, I was a part of that project. The focus was on the cost. Elon, it costs $100 million. The cells, this and that. The value of that battery, though, was to keep the system alive before gas needed to turn on or coal needed to turn on. And you didn't need to have a market capacity for baseload when you had a whole bunch of batteries kicking in and out. So the value to the system was system security and cost of the system, aside from what the battery was going to cost. And the value far outweighed the cost. So I think going forward, we need to really start thinking about, when we talk about system design, and I know the Hydrogen Council were looking at this last year, is there value in the generation of hydrogen as part of an electricity system? If we suck negatively priced wind out of the system to electrolyze, there's a value to that to the system if we can give frequency control and things like this. So, the cost will be what it will be and we'll get it down. But I'd like to think of hydrogen being a value to some clients, and the value of one person driving down the cost of the other and off taking from each other. And the example of aviation is a good one. Making it yourself is costly, but if I can take it off someone else who doesn't need it and would be then willing to pay, the value of that hydrogen is now worth a lot more to me than it was the cost of it before doing it myself.
Yeah, Josh, thank you for bringing that perspective, really. It's the engineers were all trained to break problems into chunks and then solve every part. Whereas here, this is a really good economic perspective that brings the full system together and analyzes the full value chain. Thank you for bringing that. Paul?
No, I think a lot has been said, and I do want to emphasize that human capital point as well, right? So I think ultimately you will progress at the speed of how many brain cells you really put towards these problems. And it's a hard slog. Sometimes we see at the moment a really hot market for everybody wanting to come into any energy transition related topic, but hydrogen in particular. But we need some of the best brains to kind of put both the innovation around the efficiency of the conversion processes, the automation and the scale up of the industrial kind of build out. And then of course, there's also, you know, kind of the key drivers that underlying all of this, the build out of, you know, renewables at scale, as well as, you know, kind of making some of these CCS kind of schemes work, you know, the pots and pans you need for doing that. It's all feasible, but even there you have to go down a cost curve of you know, the levelized cost of storing a single ton of CO2. I think I have not seen anything that is not kind of ready for, you know, a significant step down in cost, but you have to start building them. And as Daryl rightly says, you have to earn the right to go down that cost curve in every project that you build. And you know, we've seen that in so many other energy transition kind of themes. You know, the first LNG tankers, the first regasification terminals were so much more expensive, so much more complex than they are today. And that's where we need to get down that curve much faster if we want to kind of, you know, reach the Paris goals.
Yeah, Paul, that's a really good point. I think something that we've noticed, probably Josh and I have encountered in speaking to clients, is the sheer volume of the hydrogen economy, well, the challenge, and the investment. I think in the paper that was released, referring to 700 billion required. It is so that actually requires a network effect and a teamwork. It's we're all going to have to think of it as a system problem or opportunity, and build the right ecosystem to deliver. Probably in the past, you know, it hasn't been exactly like that. Everyone's tried to create a competitive advantage. Now, we're not going to walk away from capitalism. We're all going to have to play by the capitalist rules of return on investment. But the challenge and the opportunity is so huge. I think there is room for having the ecosystem of players working together and tackling it as a full wide system. And it'd be really good to hear some of your encounters with others. Maybe Daryl or Luke, you can talk about it. If you see more of that mentality in the industry as we embark on scaling it up, do you see that?
One area I'd probably like to cover actually on the scaling up solutions is really interesting is offshore wind and floating wind. I think that's super exciting. Look at what's happening in Scotland. There's a raft of new projects, so that's going to be really interesting to see. Particularly, the green hydrogen needs to be scaled up, but also it will benefit from a very large scale renewable project, and there's no bigger than the turbines the size of the Shard in London to support with producing this green electrolysis and green hydrogen. So that's just a solution I'd add on that. And then interested to hear Daryl's thoughts too.
I think we're coming back to the whole point of COP, where people come together and have an intelligent conversation with respect and start to discover what needs to be done and how it can be done and what's practical. And in each region around the world, there will be a slightly different story. There's a bit of a tendency in this global conversation to generalize, but you have very unique attributes. So you have Chile, for example, with the ability to produce 70 times more energy than they need domestically out of the world's best solar and best wind regime. they're capitalizing on that asset and bringing that asset to the world and generated already, I think, 70 megawatts of projects. So there's a unique situation. That's not the situation elsewhere in the world. Japan and Korea need to import a large amount of energy. They don't have onshore capability with renewables. How are they going to get that energy? Kawasaki Heavy Industries is leading with the first shipment of liquid hydrogen now. But all of these local realities and local actions have to come out of a thoughtful, respectful discussion between policymakers and the science and the technology and the hands and feet, industry, the doers. And out of that conversation, we'll understand not just what needs to be done in general or why it needs to be done, the big conversation, but now into the how and the economics and the reality. Each region of the world has a bit of a different story, and there is not one silver bullet solution that's going to give all the answers. And let me bring up another favorite topic here, another pitched ballot battle between hydrogen in transport and batteries in transport. In our study that we released in October, just ahead at COP, we explained another both and story. Both of these solutions are required and needed. And you're not going to get a whole lot of green electrons hitting Korea and Japan to deliver decarbonized transport. It's not going to happen. But if you import hydrogen, you can deliver a rapidly decarbonized transport system in Korea and Japan. And around the world, there are different mixtures of these things. You might think that, a country like Germany, are they going to get it all done with electrons? No, they're not. It's going to be a hydrogen and electron story, another both and story. And understanding these nuances and the particularity of each region and community and application requires respectful conversation between civil society and industry and NGOs, everybody coming together with respect and listening. And so what needs to disappear, and I think this latest COP it's happening, is the rhetoric and the demonization and the name calling and all these things that are kind of trumped into pitting people in the middle of the Colosseum against each other. No, I'm sorry. If we're going to get the job done here, we're going to have to change some of our human behavior away from polarization and rhetoric and more toward working together respectfully and understanding what can be done, what should be done, and how it's going to be done with precious public resources that are increasingly in short supply. So I think the quality of the conversation is actually the essence of the path forward, and good quality conversation at an event like COP is actually so nourishing to the right direction. We can't underestimate that.
Well said, Paul. Look, we're almost out of time. I think it's been such a great, lively discussion and very passionate contributions from all panel members. So I thank you all for joining us. And I was actually, Paul, Daryl, going to put a summary, but you wrapped it up so nicely, so I can't follow that. And back to you.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you. Even though we're sitting here in a virtual way, I think based on also what you just said, Daryl, I think what happened at COP is that we really came together and we understand that it's only in a collective way that we're able to solve some really big issues that we have in front of us. So I want to thank you all. It's been an amazing conversation, and yesterday, was the big energy day, and we started in the Woodhouse yesterday speaking about the role of technology in the decarbonization of industry. And then to Josh's point, we spoke about the future of carbon, because what if you can capitalize on carbon? What if you can use carbon as a great asset? What if that could be the incentive of what we're trying to do? How could we move faster even? So we are going to have a lot of conversation about that going forward. Maybe at Reuters, that could be at one point create a white paper around that. So what we're moving into now is that at the World Economic Forum, at the same time all of you were speaking, Ursula von der Leyen was speaking, the President of the European Commission. And this is now being following up with the ESG matrix for sustainable future. And after that session, we will come back into the Wood House where we'll be speaking about how do we measure emission 1, 2, and 3. And then again, at the World Economic Forum today, there's a huge session about restoring trust into global trade and supply chains. And this is where we will have a follow-up session around this at the Wood House. An amazing time, and I can only say, even though, as you said, Asa, it's not that long time ago we were at COP in person. Sad you were not there, but now you get a little bit of feeling about, because it's about the people who came to COP and the people who's going to change the world. We have begun to move the needles in a much more collective human-based way, as you also all echoed. So thank you so much. Thank you from the virtual Wood House, and there'll be a lot of conversation about hydrogen. I know the white paper we just launched, Luca shared with me the whole roadshow that is going to happen now. So we will definitely see each other soon, hopefully soon in person again. So thank you so much for being part of the session today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.